My mother loved only my sister, the golden child. When I returned to them a few years later, my sister wanted me to become her surrogate mother. My parents supported her without asking me. Growing up, Julia knew her place in the family. From the time she was old enough to recognize faces, she felt the difference. Her older sister, Sarah, was the golden child, bright, charming, and blessed with health and energy. Sarah's laughter filled the house, and her achievements lined the walls. Her parents, Robert and Linda, only had eyes for Sarah, showering her with attention, pride, and praise. To them, she could do no wrong. Julia, on the other hand, came into this world fighting. She was born with a congenital heart condition that required immediate surgery, followed by countless doctor visits and medication schedules. From the beginning, she felt like an inconvenience, a child who cost more in medical bills than she could ever repay in hugs or cute baby babble. The constant reminders of her cost came in the form of offhand comments, frustrated sighs, and the seemingly endless comparisons to Sarah. It didn't take long for Julia to understand that her parents saw her more as a burden than a blessing. Linda, her mother, was vocal about her disappointment. She'd often make remarks like, "If only we had a normal family, we'd be able to afford vacations like the Parkers," or, "Sarah could have been in more after-school activities if we didn't have to spend so much on Julia's doctors." Robert, though less overt, showed his disinterest through silence and absence. He was always busy with work, or at least, he claimed to be. Julia rarely saw him during the day, and when he was home, he focused on Sarah's school projects or her soccer games. Sarah was a natural star, shining in everything she did, and Julia was constantly in her shadow. Family gatherings were a spectacle of praise for Sarah. Aunts, uncles, and grandparents doted on her, admiring her school trophies and her charm. Julia, meanwhile, was often greeted with a quick pat on the head, followed by questions like, "How's your health, sweetie?" Or worse, "Is your heart okay?" She hated being reduced to her heart condition, despised the pity in their eyes. One Christmas, Julia was around 10, and her parents held their annual family gathering. Julia's excitement was already dampened by the knowledge that Sarah would receive most of the attention. But this year, she had been working on a handmade gift for her mother, a scarf she'd learned to knit herself, clumsily yet with earnest dedication. She imagined Linda's smile, the warmth in her eyes when she saw Julia's effort. But when the moment came, Linda barely glanced at it, giving Julia a brief, obligatory, "Oh, that's nice," before turning back to a new necklace Sarah had made in her art class. Julia's chest felt heavy, her heart condition seemingly flaring up just to mirror the pain of rejection. As the years went by, Julia started hiding parts of herself. She learned that her struggles, her doctor appointments, and even her achievements weren't seen as meaningful or worthy. One day, she scored surprisingly high on a school science test, outscoring most of her class. Eager to share the news, she showed the paper to her parents. Robert barely glanced at it, giving a lukewarm "good job, I guess," before turning his attention to Sarah's latest soccer win. Linda didn't even bother looking up from her magazine. Julia's pride was crushed. It became a recurring scene. Anytime Julia tried to share something, Sarah would overshadow it with something better, something that made her parents beam with pride. The difference in treatment wasn't just emotional. It was practical, too. Sarah was given everything she needed for her hobbies, from art supplies to soccer gear. When Julia expressed interest in joining a local reading club at her school, her mother simply dismissed it, saying, "Reading doesn't require money or clubs, Julia. Just pick up a book at home." That comment felt like a slap, and Julia learned to stop asking. Julia's resentment grew, and she became withdrawn. She dreaded weekends when Sarah would host her friends for sleepovers, and the house was filled with laughter and games that Julia wasn't invited to join. On one particular Saturday, Sarah's friends were sprawled across the living room, watching movies and eating popcorn. Julia tried to slip by unnoticed, but Sarah caught her and mockingly invited her to come watch with the big kids. Her friends laughed, and Julia's face burned as she muttered an excuse and retreated to her room. Later, she heard Sarah and her friends joking about her as if she was some unimportant bystander in her own home. One evening, Julia overheard a conversation that solidified everything she had suspected. Linda was on the phone with a friend, venting about her difficult life. She described Julia as the sickly one and praised Sarah for being the star who made up for the stress of having Julia. She even admitted that if not for Julia's health issues, they'd have a perfect family. Julia's hands shook as she listened, feeling both sick and validated. She had always known it, but hearing the words out loud from her mother's mouth left her shattered. In school, Julia struggled to make friends. Her self-esteem was fragile, and the constant comparison at home made her feel inferior. The few friends she did make often didn't last long, as Julia became guarded, afraid to let anyone too close for fear they'd see what her family saw, someone weak, burdensome, and inadequate. Sarah, on the other hand, was popular. Teachers adored her, classmates looked up to her, and her friend group was always growing. It wasn't lost on Julia that Sarah seemed to thrive in the same environment where Julia could barely keep afloat. As Julia grew older, she began seeking solace in books. Stories of resilient heroes and faraway lands became her refuge. Her love for literature blossomed, and in those pages, she found characters who fought against odds, who had battles of their own but still found victory. She dreamt of one day escaping her family's disdain, of living a life where she could be seen as more than a financial burden or a health problem. In rare moments, Sarah seemed almost kind to Julia, but those moments always had strings attached. Like the time Sarah offered to help Julia with a school project, only to later claim the credit for herself. Or when Sarah gave Julia a gift on her birthday, a necklace, but then proceeded to tell her friends how generous she had been. Julia wore that necklace for years, not because she loved it, but because it was a reminder of her place in the family. She sometimes wondered if Sarah even understood the effect her actions had, or if she was simply mirroring the favoritism she had been shown her entire life. As high school approached, the distance between Julia and her parents only grew. Linda started pressuring Sarah about college applications, making it clear that she expected her to get into a top-tier school, preferably with a sports scholarship. Julia wasn't even asked about her future. When she expressed a vague interest in studying literature, Linda dismissed it as a waste of time, saying, "No one makes a living off reading books, Julia." Her words stung, and Julia began questioning her dreams, wondering if she'd ever be capable of escaping the narrative her family had built around her. On Julia's 16th birthday, Linda and Robert threw a small party, though it was evident they had little enthusiasm for it. Julia's friends were few, and Sarah, of course, was the center of attention. Linda spent more time taking photos of Sarah with Julia's cake than actually acknowledging Julia herself. Julia was left standing alone as her family celebrated around her, feeling like a stranger at her own birthday. One night, Julia had a particularly hard time sleeping. She wandered down the hall and overheard her parents arguing. "I never wanted two kids, Robert." Her mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp and bitter. "Sarah is the only good thing that came out of this mess. If it weren't for Julia's condition, we could have done so much more." Julia's heart felt like it was collapsing under the weight of their words. She backed away, unseen, and returned to her room. That night, she realized that no matter how hard she tried to earn their approval, she'd always be the other child, the one they wished had never been born. And with that realization, something inside her changed. Julia's teenage years were marked by a quiet battle with indifference. She felt invisible in her own home. Every attempt at connection met with a dismissive wave, a cold glance, or silence. Her sister Sarah's star power only grew, magnifying the shadow cast over Julia. The years in high school solidified what Julia had always felt. She was merely tolerated, a background character in a family narrative centered around Sarah. Whenever Julia did attempt to reach out, it seemed to be a futile effort. Her attempts at joining extracurricular activities were either dismissed as irrelevant or ridiculed by her mother. When she tried art club one semester, Linda scoffed, saying, "Art? What are you going to do with that?" Meanwhile, her father barely acknowledged her presence unless he needed something fetched or an errand run. School wasn't much of an escape either. Julia's reserved nature made her an easy target for bullies, and with little emotional support from her family, she had no one to turn to for help. On one occasion, a group of girls mocked her for her quiet mouse demeanor, whispering loud enough for her to hear, laughing as they threw scraps of paper at her in class. Julia took it silently, swallowing down the hurt, knowing that even if she told her parents, they would brush it off as just kids being kids. The only people who seemed to genuinely care for Julia were her grandparents, Margaret and Harold. They'd invite her to their small, cozy home whenever they could, filling her weekends with warmth, stories, and tea. Margaret, a retired teacher with a sharp wit, would take Julia's hand and say, "You are a bright girl, Julia. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Harold, quiet but thoughtful, would sit with her in his study, patiently listening to her dreams of studying literature, encouraging her to reach beyond the limits her parents imposed. These weekends became her lifeline. But even those moments were tinged with conflict. Sarah would sometimes visit Julia's grandparents as well, seemingly out of nowhere. Sarah, with her bright smile and effortless charm, would draw Margaret and Harold's attention, telling animated stories and even singing for them. Julia could feel the air in the room shift when Sarah was around, the small oasis of safety she had feeling tainted. But Margaret and Harold saw the differences too, and one night, after Sarah had left, Margaret looked Julia in the eyes and whispered, "You deserve a life of your own, Julia." She knew Julia's heart craved independence, a place far from the stifling indifference of her family. Margaret started discussing options for Julia's future, subtly suggesting that studying somewhere far away might give her the fresh start she needed. Julia had never thought of escape as a realistic possibility, but her grandmother's words planted a seed of hope. At the end of her high school years, Julia had saved every bit of birthday money and small gifts her grandparents had given her, pooling it together. Margaret noticed and, without hesitation, offered to help with her college applications. Julia applied to schools far from home, feeling a sense of exhilaration each time she sealed an envelope, imagining a life where she could finally be free from the weight of her parents' expectations, or lack thereof. The day her acceptance letter arrived, Julia rushed to her grandparents' house, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. "I got in," she whispered, barely able to contain her excitement. Harold and Margaret exchanged glances, pride lighting up their eyes. But her joy was short-lived. When she shared the news with her parents, they barely acknowledged it. Linda shrugged, muttering, "Well, I suppose it's what you want," and Robert simply nodded absent-mindedly, already distracted by his phone. Sarah didn't even bother to hide her smirk, congratulating Julia with mock enthusiasm. With Margaret and Harold's support, Julia made preparations to leave. They secretly helped her pay for the essentials: a suitcase, a few pieces of clothing, and a bus ticket to the university. The night before her departure, she had dinner with them, a quiet celebration filled with bittersweet farewells. Margaret took Julia's hand, pressing an old, leather-bound journal into her palm. "Write your story, Julia. It deserves to be heard." The journal would become her solace, a space to spill her pain and dreams, to record the life she was building away from home. Finally, Julia left. The bus ride to the university felt surreal. She watched the familiar landscape fade behind her, replaced by an expanse of unknown roads, places untouched by her past. Arriving at campus, she was met with the overwhelming noise and energy of student life. The university was alive, bustling with students who seemed to have 1,000 friends and boundless confidence. Julia felt small, a single person adrift in a sea of strangers. Yet, there was a quiet exhilaration in that solitude. For the first time, she was free from the gaze of her family. Settling into her dorm, Julia quickly became acquainted with her roommate, Megan, a cheerful and energetic girl with a knack for drawing people in. Megan was unlike anyone Julia had ever met, compassionate, curious, and unfiltered. She asked Julia questions, genuinely interested in her life and thoughts. Julia was hesitant at first, but Megan's warmth slowly drew her out. They'd spend nights talking, Megan sharing her dreams of becoming an artist, while Julia hesitantly spoke of her love for literature. Despite this, Julia struggled with bouts of isolation. The freedom of university life came with its own challenges. She was no longer invisible, but she felt unprepared for the independence thrust upon her. The noise and social expectations drained her, and she found herself spending long hours alone in her room, immersed in her books, scribbling entries into the journal her grandmother had given her. Megan, sensing Julia's struggles, would coax her out occasionally, insisting they explore the campus or grab a coffee. One evening, as they walked through campus, they stumbled upon a small group of students gathered around a street performer, laughing and cheering. Megan pulled Julia closer, urging her to join in. At first hesitant, Julia soon found herself laughing along, the infectious energy of the crowd melting her worries. For the first time, she felt part of something larger, a welcome change from the isolation she'd endured at home. Yet, even as Julia found moments of joy, her parents' indifference lingered in the back of her mind. She had hoped that distance would make them miss her, or at least show some semblance of care. She would call home occasionally, but their conversations were brief, filled with awkward silences and generic questions. Her mother's tone was always detached, and her father barely spoke, leaving her with a growing sense of emptiness. Megan noticed Julia's somber mood one evening and asked about her family. Julia hesitated but eventually confided in her, sharing the years of neglect, the favoritism, and the deep-seated loneliness she had carried with her. Megan listened intently, her eyes filling with sympathy, and when Julia finished, she reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Julia, you're not alone anymore. You have people here who care about you." Despite Megan's friendship, Julia often retreated into solitude, her dorm room becoming a sanctuary. She spent hours in the library, immersing herself in books and writing. One night, as she was leafing through her journal, she stumbled upon a passage she had written after a particularly cold conversation with her mother. The words were raw, reflecting her pain and longing for love. Julia sat for a moment, staring at the page, feeling the weight of years of rejection press down on her. But then, something shifted. Instead of despair, she felt a spark of determination. She would make a life for herself, a life that wasn't defined by her family's indifference. Julia threw herself into her studies, spending countless hours in the library, her journal by her side. She began to write not only about her past, but also her dreams for the future. Slowly, her professors started to notice her dedication, her unique perspective, and her quiet resilience. She earned top marks, her essays praised for their insight and emotion. Her passion for literature became a refuge, a reminder that she could create something meaningful, even if her family couldn't see her worth. Through it all, Julia maintained a close relationship with her grandparents, who kept in touch through letters and occasional phone calls. Margaret's letters were filled with encouragement and reminders that she was proud of Julia. One letter, in particular, stood out to her. Margaret had written, "Sometimes, family isn't the people you're born to, but the people who love and support you for who you are. You'll find your family one day, Julia." Those words echoed in Julia's mind, filling her with hope. As she navigated university life, Julia continued to battle isolation, but with each day, she grew stronger. The small acts of kindness from people around her, Megan's friendship, her professors' encouragement, her grandparents' unwavering support, began to fill the void left by her parents. She was building her own life, piece by piece, away from the shadows of her past. And with every step forward, Julia felt herself moving closer to the person she was meant to become, free from the isolation and indifference that had once defined her. Julia's life began to transform the day she met Alex during her second year at university. She was tucked away in the library, working on an essay, when she felt someone watching her. Looking up, she saw a guy with warm eyes, a bit disheveled but genuinely friendly. He introduced himself as Alex, a history major, and apologized for disturbing her, explaining he'd been trying to figure out if he knew her from one of his classes. Julia couldn't help but smile at his awkwardness, something genuine and unassuming about him drawing her in immediately. Their first meeting was simple and unplanned, but it marked the start of something monumental for Julia. They began bumping into each other more often, sharing coffees between classes, and soon enough, these small moments grew into longer conversations. Alex had a sharp wit and a deep curiosity about the world, and he had a way of listening to Julia that no one had ever shown her before. He would ask about her thoughts, her dreams, her past, and he'd listen with genuine interest. For the first time, Julia felt seen, valued for more than just the struggle she carried. Their relationship blossomed gradually, built on a foundation of shared vulnerability. Alex opened up about his own family, one that, while supportive, had its own share of struggles. His father had passed away when Alex was a teenager, leaving his mother to raise him and his two younger siblings. He had learned responsibility early, working multiple part-time jobs to help his family get by. Julia admired his resilience, how despite everything, he was unshakably optimistic. He showed her that pain didn't have to define her. It could be something that shaped her but didn't control her. One night, as they walked back to her dorm after a late study session, Julia found herself opening up fully about her family. She shared everything: the years of indifference, the constant favoritism toward her sister Sarah, and the deep sense of isolation that had marked her entire childhood. She waited, bracing herself for pity or discomfort, but Alex only wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. "They missed out on seeing how amazing you are," he whispered. Those words stayed with her, echoing in her mind long after that night. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing day, and it wasn't long before Julia introduced Alex to her grandparents, Margaret and Harold. Margaret immediately adored him, pulling him into a warm hug and saying, "You'd better take care of her, Alex." Harold gave him a nod of approval, quietly watching as Alex helped clear dishes after dinner and laughing along with the family stories. For the first time, Julia saw her family truly happy for her, thrilled that she had someone who cherished her the way they had always hoped she would be. As graduation approached, Alex and Julia began making plans for their future. They talked about their dreams, their goals, and what they wanted out of life. Alex was offered a job teaching history at a local high school, and Julia found a position at a small publishing house as a junior editor, finally stepping into the world of literature she had long dreamed of. Together, they rented a modest but cozy apartment, filling it with books, mismatched furniture, and an abundance of laughter. Shortly after they moved in, Alex proposed. It wasn't an extravagant event. He simply took her out to the park where they'd spent countless afternoons talking about their futures. He got down on one knee, presenting a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Julia, will you build a life with me?" he asked, his eyes brimming with sincerity. Julia's heart raced as she nodded, tears in her eyes as she said yes. They married in a small ceremony, with Margaret and Harold standing proudly beside her, her grandparents beaming with joy. Her parents didn't attend. Linda had dismissed the wedding as too rushed, and Robert never even responded to the invitation. Julia felt a pang of hurt but brushed it off, comforted by the love and warmth surrounding her that day. With Alex by her side, Julia felt for the first time like she had a family of her own. Their marriage wasn't without challenges, but they faced them together. Financially, times were tough. They juggled bills, stretched paychecks, and learned to live modestly. Yet, these challenges only strengthened their bond. They'd spend evenings on their couch, wrapped in each other's arms, finding comfort in the simple presence of each other. 2 years into their marriage, Julia discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a surprise, and she was filled with both excitement and trepidation. Alex was ecstatic, lifting her up in a joyful hug and laughing until tears streamed down his face. They began preparing for their baby, budgeting carefully and transforming their small spare room into a nursery. Julia's grandparents were overjoyed, Margaret knitting baby blankets and Harold working on a wooden crib for their new great-grandchild. Their son, Noah, was born on a rainy spring morning. Holding him for the first time, Julia felt a love so profound it brought her to tears. Alex held their son with awe, promising him, "You'll never go a day without knowing how loved you are." Watching him cradle their child, Julia felt a deep sense of peace and purpose, knowing that they would create a different kind of family than the one she'd known. The early days of parenthood were exhausting yet filled with indescribable joy. They took turns with late-night feedings, laughing together through the sleepless haze. Noah's giggles filled their apartment, his little hands reaching for everything, his curiosity endless. Alex was a devoted father, spending every free moment playing with Noah, reading to him, and showing him the world. And Julia poured herself into motherhood, finding healing in the love she poured into her child. As Noah grew, Julia and Alex instilled in him a sense of security and unconditional love. They celebrated every milestone, every small achievement, cherishing him as Julia had once wished to be cherished. On weekends, they'd take him to the park, where he'd run around, his laughter ringing out as he chased after butterflies and played with the other children. Alex taught him to be kind and resilient, and Julia shared her love for books, reading to him every night before bed. Watching Noah thrive, Julia felt as though her heart was finally healing, the scars of her past fading as she built a new life filled with love and purpose. Despite the happiness she found with her own family, Julia's parents remained distant. Her mother occasionally sent a curt message asking about her well-being, but her father rarely reached out. Julia realized she no longer needed their approval. She had created her own family, one built on love and acceptance. She continued to stay close to her grandparents, who remained her biggest supporters, celebrating every new chapter in her life. Years passed, and Noah blossomed into a kind, bright young boy with his father's curiosity and his mother's quiet strength. Watching him grow, Julia felt grateful for the life they had built. The painful memories of her childhood became less burdensome, replaced by the joy of the present and the promise of a future she had forged for herself. Alex and Julia's love continued to deepen, their bond unbreakable as they faced life's challenges together. On Noah's 10th birthday, Julia stood back, watching as her son blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by friends and family. Her grandparents, though older and a bit frilier, were there, beaming with pride. Alex was by her side, his arm around her, and together they watched their son with gratitude and love. For Julia, this moment was a testament to the life she had built, a life filled with the love and family she had once feared she'd never find. In that moment, she realized she had broken the cycle. She had taken the pain and isolation of her past and transformed it into a foundation of love and belonging. And as Noah ran to hug her, his little arms wrapping around her tightly, Julia knew she had finally found the family she had always dreamed of. Julia's life had settled into a beautiful rhythm with Alex and their son, Noah. But one autumn evening, a phone call shattered the calm she had worked so hard to create. Her grandmother's voice, heavy with worry, conveyed the news that her grandfather, Harold, had fallen seriously ill. His heart was weakening, and the doctors were preparing the family for the worst. Margaret asked, voice trembling, if Julia could come back home to be with him, at least for a short while. Without a second thought, Julia agreed, feeling an urgency and a duty to return to the place she had escaped years ago. Packing quickly, Julia explained the situation to Alex and Noah. She would go ahead to see her grandparents, and if Harold's health worsened, Alex would bring Noah to join her. It had been years since Julia had set foot in her hometown. The memories of her childhood, marked by indifference and favoritism, had faded, but the idea of facing her past again made her uneasy. She was determined to avoid her parents, though, focusing her visits solely on supporting her grandparents. The journey back felt surreal, the familiar landscapes rolling by like ghosts from her past. As the bus neared her hometown, Julia felt a strange mix of dread and nostalgia. She was heading into a place that held both cherished and painful memories. She had learned to live without her parents' approval, yet part of her wondered if returning would reopen old wounds. Arriving at her grandparents' house, Julia was met by Margaret at the door. She looked worn, her usual vibrancy dulled by worry, but her face lit up upon seeing Julia. They embraced tightly, neither of them needing words to express the relief and comfort they found in each other's presence. She spent the next few hours with Harold, who was frail but managed to smile when he saw her. They shared quiet moments, Julia reading to him and holding his hand, trying to make up for lost time. Harold's warmth and kindness had been a guiding light in her life, and she was determined to be there for him now, even if it meant confronting the family she had left behind. Her plan to avoid her parents, however, unraveled within days. Word of her return had spread, and soon enough, her mother, Linda, called. The voice on the other end was uncharacteristically soft, almost pleading, as she invited Julia to dinner. Julia was stunned. She couldn't recall a single time her mother had ever used that tone with her. Still, she hesitated, knowing it was likely some obligation rather than genuine care. Linda insisted, though, and after several rounds of persuasion, Julia reluctantly agreed, more out of curiosity than any real hope of a reunion. When Julia arrived at her parents' home that evening, the air was thick with an awkward, almost forced warmth. Linda opened the door, smiling too widely, her eyes scanning Julia up and down as if taking in her transformation over the years. Robert was in the living room, pretending to be engrossed in a newspaper, though his occasional glances gave away his discomfort. Julia took a seat at the dining table, scanning the room filled with memories of quiet, lonely meals she'd endured while Sarah had basked in the family's attention. Sarah, too, was there, but she seemed different, tired, distracted, almost subdued. Gone was the charismatic, vibrant sister Julia remembered. In her place was someone who looked worn, as if life hadn't gone as effortlessly for her as everyone had expected. Sarah barely met Julia's eyes, mumbling a brief greeting before retreating into her thoughts. Dinner was awkward. Linda and Robert tried to engage Julia in small talk, but their questions felt forced and rehearsed. They asked about Alex, about Noah, but seemed uncomfortable with her answers. Julia noticed how they both seemed to fumble over their words, as if they were working off a script they'd never read before. The entire evening felt like a poorly staged performance, and Julia found herself retreating emotionally, protecting herself from whatever hidden motives might lurk beneath their newfound interest. Then, without warning, Linda blurted out, "Julia, we'd like to make up for lost time." The words hung in the air, awkward and heavy. Julia stared at her mother, trying to decipher the intent behind this sudden declaration. She was taken aback, skeptical of Linda's sincerity, but curious enough to listen. Linda went on, stumbling through an explanation about family ties and regret, while Robert nodded silently, as if in reluctant agreement. The dinner wrapped up with Linda inviting Julia to visit more often, stressing how they wanted Noah to know his grandparents. Julia felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow. They had ignored her for most of her life, only to turn around and ask for access to her son. Still, she held her tongue, nodding politely, all while her mind raced with questions. In the following days, Linda called repeatedly, each time with a request to meet again, to reconnect as she put it. Julia found it exhausting, the way her mother seemed to be pushing for some kind of idealized family dynamic that had never existed. Finally, on one such visit, Julia confronted Linda, unable to suppress her frustration any longer. "Why now, Mom? Why are you suddenly so interested in me?" Linda hesitated, her face a mix of hurt and guilt. She looked down, fidgeting with her hands, before muttering, "People change, Julia. We've made mistakes. We want to make it right." But Julia saw through it. She had spent years learning to read between the lines, to see the truth behind people's words. She pressed harder, her voice calm but unyielding. "I deserved this attention years ago, when I was a child. What's changed?" Linda's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Robert, who had been quiet through most of their interactions, finally spoke up, his voice low. "We were wrong, Julia. We know that now." But his words, too, felt empty, devoid of the genuine remorse she longed to hear. Feeling the sting of disappointment, Julia left, more resolved than ever to keep her distance. She focused on her grandfather, cherishing her final moments with him as he grew weaker. She spent countless hours by his bedside, listening to his stories, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep. Harold's love and wisdom had been her refuge, and she wanted to give him all the care she could in his last days. The day her grandfather passed away was quiet, his departure peaceful. Julia felt the loss deeply, a hole left in her heart that she knew could never be filled. Her grandparents had been her safe haven, her true family, and now half of that sanctuary was gone. She grieved quietly, with Alex and Noah by her side, their support a reminder of the family she had created for herself. After the funeral, Linda approached Julia, her face a mix of forced sympathy and thinly veiled entitlement. She brought up Noah, emphasizing how family ties were important and how they wanted to be a part of his life. Julia listened, biting back the urge to confront her mother about the hypocrisy of her sudden interest. She knew her parents' desire to connect with Noah was driven by guilt and perhaps even a sense of obligation, rather than any real love or interest. When Julia finally spoke, her voice was steady but firm. "I've built a family of my own. You're not entitled to him just because you want to feel better about the past." Linda's face fell, a mix of shock and indignation, but Julia didn't waver. She turned, leaving her mother standing there, a wall of unspoken words between them. Julia knew that the chapter of her life dominated by her parents' indifference had come to an end. She had come back to her hometown, faced the ghosts of her past, and emerged stronger, more resolute in her understanding of what family truly meant. With her grandfather's passing, Julia felt a deep sense of finality. She would carry forward his memory, his love, and his lessons, but she no longer needed to look back. Her family, the one she had chosen and built with Alex and Noah, was her focus, her future. Returning home, Julia had finally let go of the need for her parents' approval. She no longer sought their validation, no longer carried the weight of their indifference. She had her family, a life built on love, respect, and acceptance, the very thing she had spent her entire childhood yearning for. And with each step forward, she felt her heart grow lighter, her path clearer, knowing she had finally broken free from the shadows of her past. Julia's life had finally found a rhythm she cherished. She was grateful for the family she had with Alex and Noah, and after her last visit home, she thought she'd come to a delicate understanding with her parents. Although their behavior was still unpredictable, Julia had convinced herself that maybe things had softened. That was, until she received an invitation to another family dinner, this time organized by Sarah herself. Curious, and admittedly a bit wary, Julia accepted. She brought Alex along for support, hoping his presence would keep things civil. As they walked into her parents' home, Julia felt the familiar discomfort tighten in her chest. Her parents greeted her with strained smiles, and Sarah was already seated, an envelope placed conspicuously in front of her. Julia noted the tension in her sister's posture, the way her fingers tapped nervously on the table. There was a purpose to this dinner, and whatever it was, Julia sensed it was not going to be pleasant. Halfway through the meal, after enough forced small talk, Sarah reached for the envelope, her hands shaking slightly. She slid it across the table to Julia, her face carefully composed but her eyes desperate. "Julia, I need to ask you for something important," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julia opened the envelope and began reading. It was a formal letter, written by a doctor on Sarah's behalf, asking Julia to consider being a surrogate mother for Sarah's unborn child. Julia's heart dropped. Her hand trembled as she put down the letter, staring at her sister in disbelief. "You want me to carry your child?" she whispered, stunned. Sarah's eyes were filled with a strange mixture of desperation and expectation. "Yes, Julia. You're healthy, and the doctor said you're likely to have a safe pregnancy, even with your heart condition. I've tried everything else, and I just can't. I need this." She reached across the table, her tone pleading. Julia felt a storm of emotions rise within her. "Sarah, my heart condition is manageable, but a pregnancy could make it worse. This is dangerous for me. You're asking me to risk my life," she said, her voice cracking. Before Sarah could respond, Linda jumped in, her tone sharp. "Julia, don't be dramatic. This is family. This is what family does for each other." Julia looked around the table, and her parents' faces mirrored Sarah's sense of entitlement. To them, this was not a request, it was a duty. "I can't," Julia said firmly, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but I can't do this." She felt the weight of her decision, the finality of it. Yet she knew it was the only choice she could make for herself and her family. The room fell silent, and then her father's voice sliced through the quiet. "Selfish," he muttered under his breath. Julia looked at him, disbelief and hurt spreading across her face. He met her gaze, his expression cold. "You've always been selfish, Julia. It's no surprise you'd refuse to help your sister in her time of need." Linda nodded in agreement. "I don't know how you can be so heartless, Julia. We raised you better than this." Julia could barely contain her anger. Years of repressed pain and disappointment surged within her, but she held her ground, clenching her fists beneath the table. "Alex, sensing her struggle, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He looked at her parents with a calm but firm resolve. Julia has given this family everything she could, and for you to ask something like this of her, something that could risk her life, is beyond unreasonable. We're leaving. As they stood to go, Sarah's voice broke, trembling with anger and frustration. Julia, I thought we were finally becoming close again. I thought you understood. You're my only hope, and you're just walking away. But Julia didn't look back. Over the next few days, the pressure from her family intensified. Sarah bombarded Julia with calls and messages, alternating between pleading for sympathy and lashing out in frustration. Her parents joined in too, calling her selfish, accusing her of abandoning her sister in her hour of need. Julia was exhausted, emotionally drained by the relentless onslaught. Every message felt like a wound, cutting deeper into her resolve. Then, one morning, Julia received a call from her mother. Linda's tone was colder than ever, and her words were sharper than any insult Julia had heard before. Julia, if you won't do this willingly, there are legal ways to make you reconsider. Your sister has rights, and we're willing to go to court to ensure you fulfill your responsibilities to this family. Julia felt a surge of panic, her mind racing. Court? They were threatening legal action to force her into surrogacy? The notion was absurd, but her parents' tone made it clear that they were serious. Julia hung up, her hands shaking. She knew she couldn't handle this alone anymore. After confiding in Alex, who supported her without question, Julia decided to contact a lawyer. They found someone highly recommended, a sharp, compassionate woman named Emma Reed, who specialized in family law. Emma listened patiently as Julia recounted the threats, the relentless pressure, and the potential legal action her parents were hinting at. Emma leaned forward, her eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. Julia, let me be clear. No one can legally force you into becoming a surrogate. What they're doing is emotional manipulation, plain and simple. You have every right to refuse. Her words brought Julia a sense of relief she hadn't felt in weeks. She knew she had a right to protect herself, and now, she had someone on her side willing to help her do just that. Over the following weeks, Emma helped Julia prepare a case against any potential legal threats. She advised Julia to keep records of every message, every voicemail, and every interaction where her family pressured or threatened her. It was painful to compile, each message a reminder of how little her family valued her autonomy. But with each piece of evidence gathered, Julia felt her strength returning. She was reclaiming control over her life, refusing to be a pawn in her family's manipulation. Despite the mounting pressure, her family refused to back down. Linda continued to send messages, each one more desperate than the last. You're tearing this family apart, Julia. One text read, we just want you to do what's right. Sarah, too, persisted, alternating between guilt-tripping and outright anger, unable to comprehend why Julia wouldn't risk everything for her. The final break came one evening when her father showed up unannounced at her doorstep. Julia opened the door, startled to see him standing there, his face lined with anger. He wasted no time with pleasantries. You're going to regret this, Julia, he spat. This family gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? Julia stood her ground, Alex by her side. She looked at her father, her voice steady but filled with years of pent-up resentment. You didn't give me everything. You treated me like I was invisible, unworthy, a burden. And now you want to force me to risk my life? I owe you nothing. Her father's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. He turned and left, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoing like a final punctuation mark on a chapter Julia knew was closing for good. With Alex's unwavering support and Emma's legal guidance, Julia decided to cut ties with her family once and for all. It was not a decision she made lightly. The idea of severing her last ties to the people who had raised her, however poorly, was both heartbreaking and liberating. She spent hours reflecting on her childhood, on the years of neglect, the relentless favoritism, the emotional wounds that had taken years to heal. And in those moments of clarity, she realized she had already given them more than they ever deserved. The next day, Julia sent one final message to her family group chat. I'm done. I won't be manipulated or bullied into risking my life for anyone. Don't contact me again. She blocked their numbers, a final act of closure, sealing away the years of pain and heartbreak. With her family out of her life, Julia felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She no longer lived in the shadow of her parents' expectations, no longer carried the weight of their indifference. She was free, truly free, to build a life defined by love, respect, and acceptance, the very qualities she had always longed for but never received from them. Julia's days became brighter, filled with laughter and peace. She threw herself into her family, nurturing the bond she shared with Alex and Noah. Together, they created new memories, filling their home with warmth and joy. Every day, Julia felt the weight of her past lift a little more, replaced by a profound sense of contentment. In her heart, Julia knew she had made the right choice. She had broken free from the toxic cycle that had held her captive for so long, choosing her own happiness over a hollow sense of duty. For the first time, she felt whole, her life filled with the family she had created, a family built on love, loyalty, and unwavering support.